Today we have Keston Judici, our certified crop advisor. He's basically able to give us a little bit of insight here on some of the more detailed elements of soil testing, crop fertility, things like that. Our whole goal here is to build this industry and to try to help folks grow the crops and to their full genetic potential. And the only way to do that is to really understand their uptake curves, really understand their consumption rates at different seasonalities, different planting densities. And those are all things that we've kind of seen through different agronomic trials and genetic trials. So we're just trying to take some of that experience and summarize it in this little webinar episode here. And as we go along, we'll get deeper into things like in future webinar series, we'll get deeper into focus things like IPM and other things. But today we're going to really just zero in on fertility and irrigation management. And so I'm just going to pass it on to Keston.
George, like George said, my name is Keston Judici. I work as a certified crop advisor for LA Hearn Company. LA Hearn Company is an independent fertilizer distributorship based in King City, California. We service the Central Coast, mostly focusing in strawberries and vegetables, but have been working in hemp since 2018, both in the seed production and CBD production side. LA Hearn Company in King City, we have two blending facilities, conventional and organic. Essentially, we're able to provide our customers with custom blends that address their specific farm's needs. And like George said, help these plants meet their genetic potential. Today, we're going to keep it pretty focused. Soil and water reports, we'll do a review of those first. We'll talk a little bit about ground preparation and pre-plant fertilizer regimes. We'll cover fertilizer and irrigation management. And then we'll also look at some monitoring tools to help us address different fertilizer needs and irrigation needs throughout the season. So we're going to start off here just looking at a soil report, kind of talk about some different areas to focus on, some things to look at. This is going to assist you in site selection. A lot of times we have some different options as far as where we are going to be planting hemp, and want to identify what potential antagonists or what potential imbalances may exist so that we can make sure we're choosing the best site to produce our crop. When I'm looking at soil reports, the first thing I look at right there in the center, kind of below the nutrients, is your CEC. Essentially, this is your cation exchange capacity. It's your soil's ability to hold cations. A good way to picture it is picture kind of a parking lot, and there's parking spots. The higher that CEC, the more parking spots or negative charges there are on that colloid that will attract your positively charged cations. Your four main cations that we see in our soils are calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. And how those are found on the colloid is really going to determine how our soil is structured. In general, you can kind of get a general idea of soil type by looking at that. Very generally, sand is low, so you're going to see that in around 1 to 5, 1 to 10 range. Your loam soil is going to be a little bit of a higher CEC, a little more holding capacity, 5 to 15. Your clay loam is going to run 15 to 20, sometimes up to 30, and then you're going to see your clay soils with the highest coal holding capacity around 30 or more. The height of your CEC, the level of CEC is really going to determine how much you're able to influence that cation balance that exists. Next, we're going to look at our pH. pH is essentially potential for hydrogen. The higher the level of hydrogen in the soil, the lower your pH is going to be. And inverse, the lower the hydrogen is, the higher your pH will be. This pH can affect the balance of your base saturation or the balance of your cations, because if there's an abundance of hydrogen, that's going to start to steal places from your other positively charged cations like potassium and sodium. Ideally, if you talk, most people, it's a pretty common understanding that your pH ideal range is going to be between 6.3 and 6.5, and that will give you the zone where both your macro and micronutrients are most available. Our next thing we looked at, I had mentioned during CEC, is our base saturation. That's to the right of the report. You can see there's the balance of your potassium, your sodium, your calcium, and your magnesium. This is telling us how balanced or imbalanced our soil profile is. In general, once again, very general guidelines, you want to see your calcium between 65 and 75% on the base saturation, your magnesium somewhere between 10 and 15%, your potassium around 5%, and you'd like to see that sodium number under 5, usually around 3 to 3%. If this is if these things are in balance, we have proper porosity, proper flocculation, and that's where our soil water plant relationship will be the most successful at these balance ranges on the base saturation. As we move into our nutrients, it's really our decision to do amending or not to do amending is really going to depend on a couple different things. One, it's going to be your CEC and your base saturation. If you have a very high CEC, it's going to be very hard to influence the soil in any way. It's going to depend a little bit on your budget. How much money do you have up front to make these amendments before your crop goes in the ground? And it's going to come down to equipment. Do you have that capability of getting these amendments applied and placing them in the proper place before, or is it easier to run a lot of these amendments through your water in season? So a lot of these decisions are going to be based on what your capabilities are and what your budget is when it comes to amending soil. If I were to just go through and make a general adjustment to this soil report in particular, I would look at addressing, in our area, we are consistently low on zinc and copper. So I would look to address my zinc and copper a little bit there. I would probably also amend some phosphorus and potassium in this situation. Because it's a pre-plant and because our crop's uptake of nitrogen and other things won't come for a while, I would probably avoid doing any nitrogen pre-plant at this point and save a lot of that, or I'm sorry, any nitrogen amending at this point, and we'd save that nitrogen application for our pre-plant fertilizer.
Can I ask you a quick question about that, Keston?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different fertilizer companies out there trying to push a lot of different types of bottled amendments and things like that. So what kind of tips can you give to folks that are listening in here to kind of avoid the snake oil out there, or just avoid spending too much? And how can you really keep your focus on what matters most in terms of fertility?
So generally, I think that the soil report is a good deciding factor in that. Depending on how in balance or out of balance the soil report may be, that's really going to be a good indicator of how much needs to be spent up front. The fact that plants are not in the ground yet, we don't want to be spending too much money on soil amending or on pre-plant fertilizer, because a lot of that isn't going to be in the right place once that plant goes in the ground. So the idea is, for soil amending, you want to be just touching up maybe your micros, maybe things that are a little bit more expensive in season, so you can try and put that plant in the most balanced ground as possible. We'll touch on this a little bit later as well, but for now, think of your soil amending as just trying to rebalance that soil and setting up a good foundation for when that plant's put in the ground. From there, now that we've gone through our CEC, our pH, we looked at our base saturation, we kind of see what our nutrient balance is. We also need to look at our irrigation water for that particular ranch. Irrigation water is something that could potentially hold a lot of antagonists that we can't really see, but that are definitely there once we start to talk about applying water in a large way, in multiple acre feet per season. So things to look for in your water, you're really going to want to look for what elements can create problems in excess. So on this particular report, it is reported in mill equivalents per liter. which is really somewhat difficult to determine what level's good and bad there. Luckily, A&L Labs, along with these reports, they provide a sheet that helps us to convert per milliequivalents to parts per million, so we can determine how many pounds of each element we're applying per acre foot of water. So essentially, we want to be looking at our sodium, our chloride, our bicarbonate. We want to really understand at how much we're applying per acre foot of water with those, because those can become problems when it comes to excess or toxicity. We also want to compare how that, we also want to see how that compares to our calcium and our potassium that's going out. So I did a little math ahead of time, but essentially we have our sodium numbers. We're going to look at the JVT, that report. So we'll look at our sodium number, our calcium number, our bicarb number, our chloride number, and our potassium number. So the sodium, the calcium, the bicarbonate, and the chloride, those are all reported in milliequivalents. So if we go to this sheet, and this is actually available on A&L's website, there's a lot of information there, but essentially what we're doing, if you look at the top left-hand corner, you see sodium there. They're giving us a conversion factor to convert sodium from milliequivalents per liter to parts per million. So we take those factors, 23 for sodium, 20 for our calcium, 61 there for our bicarbonate, 35 for our chloride, and then we have a conversion factor for potassium that essentially will put our potassium in our water in the K2O form. So if we do those conversions, sodium, we take our 8.87 times our 23, gives us 204 parts per million. An acre foot of water weighs 2.7 million pounds. So we take those parts per million, we multiply those by 2.72, and that gives us a general idea of how many pounds of sodium we're applying per acre foot of water. In this particular case, our sodium, we're applying 550 pounds per acre foot. Our chloride, we're applying 832 pounds per acre foot. Our bicarbonate, we're applying 1,160 pounds per acre foot. Those are all the bad guys. When you look at calcium, we're only applying 195 out of the well water per acre foot, and our potassium is only 11 pounds of K2O. So as we can see, we have a little bit of an imbalance between our good guys and our bad guys. So these are some things we're going to want to take into consideration when we're developing our in-season program to address some of these antagonists and try and keep them at bay as we are irrigating and as we need to put more water out. There are some water treatments to consider. Obviously, you need to kind of decide whether you're an organic or conventional setup when it comes to water treatment. But as far as the most harsh option is, we can utilize a sulfuric acid, which will help to address our bicarbonate issue. We also can use a little bit less harsh of a product like sulfuric acid, which is essentially urea, nitrogen, and sulfuric acid blend, non-corrosive and safe to the touch. In the organic world, there's acetic acid, there's citric acid. These aren't going to have as much efficacy, and they're going to be a lot larger price tag. And then also in the organic side, we do have sulfur burners that we have access to. But really, a lot more homework needs to be done before we decide on which water treatment to make or if we need it in general. I've seen a lot of hemp crops that were in less than ideal situations when it came to water, and they were still able to thrive without too much water treatment happening. It's also possible in a situation like this where we are low on our calcium and our potassium going out to supplement the irrigation water with those two elements to help bring those into a little bit more of a balance, and that will make our antagonists less troublesome. So we've gone through our soil report, we've gone through our water report, we've decided on what block we want to grow in this year. And so now we kind of need to look at preparation. When you're preparing your field, it's pretty much like building the foundation of the house. So we want to take the proper time and want to make sure that we check all the boxes, that we're setting up our crop from day one when it comes to ground prep. Depending on who you talk to and what your style of growing is, it can go from as far as the ripping, the disking, the ring rolling, the leveling, really getting that field ready for the service company to come out and put those beds up. Going back, we touched on it a little bit there in the soil reports, but talking a little bit more on amending. When it comes to amending, just like we have so many pounds in an acre foot of water, we have so many pounds in an acre foot of soil. So if you look at the top 6 inches of your soil profile, you're looking at about 2 million pounds of dirt that's sitting there. And if you look at the top 12, you're looking at about 4 million pounds. So the idea of amending, you got to be a little careful of getting too carried away with amending, because there's so much to influence there. Sometimes it's better to just influence solution in season versus spending a lot of money up front on amending. So once again, like we talked about, touching up some micronutrients, maybe focus on a little bit of potassium that's short. But ideally, we'll talk about this a little later, but in season fertility programs, we can really do a lot of in-season adjustments because of our drip irrigation and because of our ability to deliver nutrients right to that root zone.
Keston, what would you say for folks that might have a pivot system or a flood system, or might not have the access to drip? Is there anything, a different approach that they would take?
So if you were on a larger scale, like a pivot or something like that, you would probably want to focus on, so we're talking about 3 different things here. We have our soil amending, we have our pre-plant fertilizer, which will be put out much closer to the crop, and then we have our in-season fertility. If you're on something like a pivot, it would probably be a good idea to bolster up your pre-plant program so that you can take advantage of more of those nutrients at a lower cost point in the dry form. And then you can do a little bit more supplementing through the water as your crop grows. So really, I mean, once again, this is a pretty general overlook of anything. If anyone needs to dig in to specific questions per farm, we can cover those at the back end as well. So we're through our amending, our soil's flat, it's ready to be put into beds. Your bed size is really just going to be dependent on the area that you're in. For example, the Central Valley, they're pretty common to see 30-inch, 60-inch beds, versus here on the coast, we're more of a 40 and 80-inch bed setup. Use what's convenient for you and what equipment you have access to, but then also think about your planting density when you're looking at bed configuration. If you're looking to have a lower plant density with much larger plants, you may want to go towards a bigger bed to give you a little bit more room on your shoulders. If you are, say, taking a day neutral crop and you're looking at a much higher plant per acre count, you're probably going to want to shrink those down to 40-inch beds and tighten everything up and also because that plant's just not as big as a photoperiod plant may be. This is also the time when you're putting the beds up is the time to look at drip, what you're going to do as far as irrigation in general. If it's a buried drip situation, this might be a time to start looking at that. And if that's the case, if you are planning on burying your drip, depth is very important. You definitely don't want it too close to the surface because that could interfere when you're trying to cultivate your soil later down the road. And you obviously don't want it too deep because then all of a sudden your starting point of irrigation is out of the root zone. So all of those things can be taken into account on the bed size. Also, we are going to, at this point, start to look at pre-plant fertilizer. You have a couple options when it comes to pre-plant. You can put it out when you are doing your listing. Your placement of that isn't going to be as accurate as if you come and put it out after your beds are already placed. When coming to pre-plant in general, we're going to want to treat our photoperiod plants and our day neutral plants much differently. If you look at the time that a day neutral plant has to vegetate versus a photoperiod plant, there's a lot less time that happens. So which means the nitrogen uptake is going to be much higher up front for a day neutral crop versus a photoperiod. So, oh, go ahead, George.
Keston, would you say that some of the low cannabinoid numbers and some of the leafier, looser bud structures that we saw last year in day neutral crops could be attributed to excess nitrogen towards that later half of the day neutral cropping cycle.
So we'll touch on it a little bit later, but essentially the form of nitrogen and the timing of the applications is really going to drive plant growth. So we look at our fertilizers, we're essentially influencing the plant growth regulators that are produced within the plant. Plant growth regulators signal the plant to achieve different growth habits. So if we're using certain forms, especially nitrogen at the wrong time of the year, we can create an imbalance in our plant growth regulators, which may give you some less than desired results. We'll look at the tracking of all that a little bit later. So as far as the starter stuff goes, the starter fertilizer, once again, very site specific. It's going to depend a lot on the type of crop that you're looking to grow. But the fact that we do see a heavier consumption of nitrogen up front with hemp in your pre-plant fertilizer, it is a good idea to get some nitrogen and some goodies out there ahead of time so that when those roots really start to transpire and take water out of the soil, there's a good sufficient amount of fertility there. One thing that I see a lot of times happens is people try and push your soil beneficials a little bit too early. Remember that a lot of the biology, the bacteria, the fungi that exist, they need roots to be able to colonize. So a lot of times, if you're looking to do beneficials, it's a better idea to get your fertilizer out ahead of planting and then wait to start applying those beneficials until a couple weeks have gone by and that plant's actually been able to establish a good root biomass. Couple other things we'll go real quick just to kind of cover here. I flipped to my next page and saw I still had some more. Once your beds are up, once your pre-plant's down, before you've put your plants in the ground, it's probably a good idea to get some pre-irrigation events out there. That pre-irrigation will bring good moisture into the soil so that when you're planting your plant, there's less stress there. Along with that pre-irrigation, once that soil dries down a little bit before planting, if you have access to a bed mulcher, it's like a large rototiller that goes behind the tractor, that will help to break up any large clods that exist. It'll create better root contact when you transplant that plant. It'll help with water distribution uniformity. It'll keep water from going directly down and help that move out to the sides. We'll talk about soil water a little bit later. If you're direct seeding, it's very important to not only manage the depth of that seed, but that initial moisture that's delivering to get that seed out of the ground. One question we get a lot when it comes to the bed prep is, should I put plastic out or should I not put plastic? From what we've seen, the plastic is there most of the time for weed suppression. So if you don't have the means of mechanical cultivation, it is probably a good idea to help with weed suppression there with plastic. Other than that, it's definitely a lot more work up front. It's a lot more work to clean up on the back end. It could help with soil temperatures, bringing those up in cooler areas in the spring, but it can also be an issue in middle of the summer, creating too hot of an environment there in the soil with the plastic. You definitely are going to be able to maintain better moisture having that plastic there, just due to less evaporation that'll happen out of the soil. So from there, we'll jump into fertility management a little bit. And so pretty much picture now, we've got our plants in the ground, our pre-plant fertilizer has been applied, we have our plants in the ground, and now we're starting to execute our in-season fertilizer regime. We're going to want to tailor our program to the crop that we're growing. So this once again goes back to a day neutral versus photo period. In this picture here, you can see that this is a day neutral versus a photo period. As you can see, the day neutral is already pretty far into flower, and our photo period crop hasn't even started flowering yet. So the fertilizer plan that we need to run on these two different types of hemp is going to be pretty different in how we get that fertilizer out there. So the day neutral, like we mentioned before, it completes stages of growth in a much shorter amount of time. So we have to act much quicker in how we execute our plan. In the day neutral, probably a good idea to front load a little bit more nitrogen, um, front load a little bit more potassium, and have that phosphorus available. Where in the photo period, it may not, you won't see as large of an uptake initially. Go ahead, George, you got a question? Oh, you good. So anyway, so that's going to come down to, are you growing a photo period or a day neutral? What is your planting density? That's really going to depend. I mean, if you look at a lot of the photo period stuff, guys are a couple thousand, 3,000 plants an acre versus some of the day neutral stuff, we're recommending up to 20, 30,000 plants an acre. Because of that plant density, that's really going to be a difference in the pounds per acre of consumption when it comes to your macros and your micronutrients. Your planting date is going to have a lot to do with it as well. A lot of these autos are recommended to plant a lot earlier. Day length's a lot shorter, so uptake is going to be influenced by that day length, by the heat, the soil temperature. All of these things are things we need to take into account when we're starting to execute that. Another thing is how many months are in the ground. So if you look at an auto, you're in the ground for say 60 to 80 days. A lot of that program needs to happen in a much shorter time. And then also just what are your harvest goals? What is your potential return on investment? In my regular crops, we usually kind of have a general rule where our fertility budget makes up about 10% of the overall money spent on the crop. So that could kind of give you an idea. I mean, that's kind of pulling from your veggies or your strawberry stuff. So I kind of try and run that same rule when it comes to hemp. Given the current market and a little bit better pricing, we can actually be even a little bit more liberal there, but I think 10% is a pretty good number for overall budget when it comes to in-season fertility. So this slide, I pulled this from the CDFA website, and essentially this is just showing for nitrogen in particular, but it can be related to a lot, pretty much all of our nutrients, just looking at the growth stage of the plant and the consumption during those different growth stages. So once again, kind of talking about pre-plant and talking about the beginning of our in-season fertility, these plants in say the first photo period, first month, day neutral, first 2 or 3 weeks, there's going to be very little uptake that happens. So we're going to want to mirror our program, and the quantities of fertilizer that we're putting out are really going to want to be relatable to the different stages of growth and how much is being taken up based on the size of the plant and the time of the year. So when we're building our program, we got to really keep in mind the 4R, nutrient management, essentially putting your product in the right place, using the right source, putting it out at the right time, and keeping the right rate. With hemp in general, we kind of, these are once again very general guidelines. There still needs to be a lot more data collection and a lot more trialing done when we actually track the units per per season as far as consumption goes for our macros and our micros. But some general ratios that we can keep when it comes to our vegetative state, we want 3 parts nitrogen, 1 part phosphorus, and 2 parts potassium. When it comes to our transition period from our vegetative to our flowering, it's more of a 1 part nitrogen, 2 parts phosphorus, 3 parts potassium. And then in our flower stage and through to finish, we want to reduce that nitrogen down to 0 to 1 parts, to 2 parts phosphorus to 3 parts potassium. So essentially by adjusting those ratios, we're influencing the plant growth regulators that plant is producing, and we're driving it to achieve different growth cycles. So during vegetative, we need extra nitrogen, we need extra potassium, but as that flowering or that fruiting action comes on with the plant, you want to really reduce that nitrogen. What George was referencing earlier. Excess nitrogen later in a growth cycle can create an auxin response, which creates a stretch. And that's where you see larvae flowers, loose growth is just, it's not so much that it's the nitrogen doing it, but it's the fact that the ratio isn't balanced in how the fertility is being delivered at that point. So we want to really make sure that we're following those three stages and those three ratios during the growth cycle. And then also keep in mind your nutrient uptake curve and how that is going to influence nutrient uptake at the different growth stages of the plant. In general, when you're using, say, nitrogen, for example, just be aware of the forms that you're applying and how much you're applying it at a time. Excessive nitrate nitrogen, even early in a hemp crop, can create a larger internode space. It can create a stretch in your plant, which is going to be a little bit detrimental when you start to build flower. That plant won't be as able to maintain structure to support that crop. So we're really going to want to feed a nice balance of figure about a quarter nitrogen, a quarter nitrate nitrogen, a quarter ammoniacal nitrogen, and then about a half of that is going to want to be in the urea form. If you're able to use any sort of urea stabilizer, that will help to keep that nitrogen in the urea form longer, and it'll keep that real stretchy growth from happening. Once you're into flower, you're going to only want to feed ammoniacal and urea forms or animal-based aminos. I mean, nitrogen's going to be necessary through the whole crop growth, but the forms and the amount in flowering is very important to control those levels going out so that you don't get a big nitrate uptake and you don't create that stretch that we're talking about. In general as well, I think it's good practice to feed small pulse irrigations and try and incorporate fertility as many times a week as you can. A smaller, more frequent irrigation with fertility is going to be a lot better than large irrigation runs with fertility. I mean, I guess I compare it to human consumption. We want to have a little bit every day to keep us going. So we try and kind of practice those same sort of cultural practices in our crop production, just feeding, maybe when my strawberries, for example, 2 or 3 times a week, we have water going out, and at least 2 times during that week, we're putting fertility out as well. It's good to kind of find out what's compatible. So we can usually run our nitrogen and our calcium applications at the front of the week, our phosphorus and potassium applications towards the end of the week, and then we can kind of use micronutrients in combination with those applications as we go. So fertility programs, the success of your fertility program is really going to depend on how well you manage your irrigation. And nutrients move with water. So if we can maintain a good amount of moisture in our top 12 inches and not push too much beyond that, we're going to be able to keep our nutrients in that same place. So understanding water holding capacity is really important. So when we irrigate, our soil fills up, our pore space fills up with water. And as we over irrigate, we start to run out of space in that top 12 inches and we create what they call gravitational water. So that's just water lost to gravity. That's going to move water and nutrients past that root zone. After that, once we cut off our water, that gravitational water has stopped moving. Our soil has a hold on what we call field capacity. So our soil will be able to support a certain amount of water that's suspended in the soil profile, some that is tied to colloid, and then some that is free for plant uptake. So ideally, field capacity, we want to kind of float somewhere between field capacity or just below field capacity, which will allow our plant to always be transpiring, taking up nutrients and growing. As we move past field capacity, we get to a point where the hold of the soil on the water is greater than the plant's ability to take it up. And that's what we call permanent wilting point. At this point, the plant is no longer able to draw water from the soil. The stomatas will close and nutrient uptake will cease. And this is essentially your plant becomes idle. And so we really want to manage. We don't want to be too oversaturated. We don't want to hit that permanent wilting point. So really managing and pulsing that irrigation to be moving things side to side and not so much up and down. Also, you really want to understand the type of soil that you're working with. I found this other photo here online last night. Essentially, this is giving you an idea of per soil type, how your water is going to act with that soil. There is something called capillary action. So if there's a puddle on a table and you were to put a paper towel into that puddle, you'll start to see that moisture move through that paper towel. That's capillary action, essentially water moving through the pore space. So with the three different types of soil, because the pore space is the largest in sand, sand's going to be the hardest to get water to move laterally. You're going to see a lot of vertical movement there, and you're going to create what we call preferential flow, where it's just the water is going to take the path of least resistance and move very vertical. So with a sandier soil, we really want to control the length of our runtime and really pulse that to force that water out to our shoulders and get good distribution. With loam, you're going to have a little bit more capillary action. It's going to be a little bit easier to get that water moving laterally. And then with the clay, you're going to have the most, and that'll be the easiest to get water to move laterally. So really watching our duration and our frequency is going to be able to create that good uniform moisture in the soil. Moving on, so we've gotten through our fertility in general. We've gotten through our irrigation. A lot of this is really tough to do if you're just out observing the farm. So I really encourage, especially because a lot of parameters haven't been established for hemp yet, I really encourage people to use as many monitoring tools as they can, because that's really what's going to help you decide what the right decision is week to week when it comes to irrigation, when it comes to fertility, when it comes to all those on-farm decisions. So as far as monitoring tools go, my favorite and what I use more than anything is that soil probe there on the left-hand side. Essentially, this is going to give me, right-hand side. It's going to give me just a great judge of how my moisture is changing through the profile. Pretty much if you look at your aerobic zone in most areas, it's your top 6, maybe 8, maybe 12 inches of the soil profile where our plants are actually able to take up nutrients. So this is going to give us a good idea of how that moisture is changing through the profile. It's also great for pulling soil samples in season to judge where your soluble nutrients can be, through a saturated paste test, things like that. In the middle there at the top, that's my EC and temperature probe. EC is pretty much the measurement of the amount of salts that are in your soil. Excessive conductivity can cause plant stress, and it can lower microorganism activity in the soil. So this is a good judge of, I guess, how hot your spark is in the soil. You need good conductivity to maintain plant growth, but excessive conductivity can be detrimental. Essentially, this is a day-to-day in-field way of checking to see how salt accumulation is happening, how chlorides are accumulating. It can also be a good judge of when you are applying fertilizer, how much that is increasing conductivity. Pretty much it's not specific, but it correlates to nitrates, potassium, sodium chloride, sulfates, and ammonia. So that's going to kind of give you a good idea. So using it during irrigation events, seeing how that's influencing your EC, and then also using it during fertilizer to try and maintain a consistent level of EC through your growing cycle. We want to start with a lower EC during plant establishment, and then as that plant grows, we can safely increase that EC to help support the growth. The temperature probe, I mean, obviously that's pretty self-explanatory, but it's good for planting. especially when you're going direct seed, or if you're trying to figure out when's a good time to pull the trigger on putting those transplants in the ground. Soil biology in general doesn't really start moving until it gets to 60 degrees or maybe a little bit more. So we're going to want to monitor that soil temperature leading up to planting to make sure we're in a good, an ideal temperature that those plants are actually going to start to be able to utilize soil nutrients. Biology will be working. So that 60-degree mark is pretty good. And then we can kind of track our soil temperature through the season, and that will give us connections to how our nutrients, let's say nitrogen, for example, how it's going through the different nitrogen transition stages. In the middle there in the bottom, those are nitrate quick tests. Essentially, you get a solution with distilled water and your soil, shake that up, you can dip those in there, and that's going to give you an idea of how much nitrate is available. These are really handy, especially once you start to get into flower, to really be able to track and understand where your nitrogen is so that we don't create any unwanted plant growth. Refractometer, that's on the bottom left there. Essentially, that's measuring the solids in the plant sap. It gives us an idea of our plant health, and it gives us an idea of the plant's nutrient density. This is really going to be a driver and an indicator of your soil health, your nutrient balance, and how efficient your irrigation is going. So you could kind of compare this to taking a blood test. So those are kind of the day-to-day things that I use. And then on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, depending on the crop that you're growing, tissue sampling is very important. Tissue sampling, usually the practice that we do is we take a set of tissues of newer leaves, and then we take a set of older leaves. We send those in separately, and then it gives us an idea of, for our mobile and immobile nutrients, how those are moving around the plant, but then also the access that our plant has to nutrients in the soil. This is really a big driver in the nutrient decisions that you make in season, and it allows you to spot issues before they become visible in the plant and make adjustments so that your plant growth isn't bothered or isn't affected. For autos, I would recommend probably at day 21 taking your first tissue, and then probably every week after that through the rest of the growth cycle, taking tissues to make your adjustments there. And then your photo periods probably once you're about a month in, and then pulling tissues every 2 weeks after that is going to really give you an idea of what your plant's looking like. Soil moisture monitoring. So, it was kind of, it seems a little overwhelming to try and understand what that water movement and everything else is looking like in the soil. We're using these tensiometers. Essentially, tension is a measurement of suction that the soil is applying on the water in the soil, and that's going to be connected to water availability. So essentially these tensiometers, they have a porous tip. That whole cylinder is full of moisture, and as the soil dries, it begins to pull water out of that porous tip, and that suction is measured on the gauge there at the top. On the graph on the right, that blue zone is kind of your ideal zone, and the two lines represent a 6-inch probe and a 12-inch probe. This is ideal irrigation because you can see as the lines raise up, water becomes less available. Until we get to the top of that, we have an irrigation event as it drops down. We can see we did not push the green line, which is our deep probe, down to 0. So we kept that at field capacity and avoided gravitational water. We completely saturated our 6-inch probe. So that means that our soil profile has a nice balance of water. It's a physical measurement, so it's a great way to determine available moisture to your plant and to always allow plants to be transpiring. It's a good way to track water movement. So your vertical movement with your deep probe, your lateral movement with your shallow probe. Couple options. There's the tensiometer by aerometer. That's more of a manual tool. And then there is a company called Hortow that uses that same measurement attention that essentially is a real-time program that you can download an app to your phone and have real-time measurements that way. Both work very well, and both a great tool to relate to a physical measurement when you're in the field. The last thing I want to cover real quick, I think I'm probably running long here, but this is probably one of my most relied upon tools that we use out in the field. Lysimeter, it works similar to the tensiometer. It's just a little bit different in that in the tensiometer, water is being pulled out of the tip, and that's creating a suction in the cylinder. In the case of a lysimeter, we actually apply a vacuum to that, and it draws soil solution from the soil into the probe. There's a company in Santa Maria called Ag Laboratories and Consulting. They have a service where these come and get installed, and then they're coming and pulling, depending on your crop, they're pulling every week, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, the solution out of these lysimeters. And that solution is, we're able to get a snapshot of essentially what is root available. So if you see the image on the right, we can see the clay particles are elements that are tied to CEC, and we can also see the solution and what's available to the root hairs. So that lysimeter is giving us a snapshot of what is root available, what's plant available, and what our plant actually has access to in that soil profile. It's going to help us. Here's a report that they do. This is how it comes back. You can see the top is our 6-inch, our bottoms are 12-inch, and essentially we're able to keep track real time of our pH, our EC, our chloride and our sodium, our ammoniacal and nitrate nitrogen, our phosphorus, our potassium, our calcium, and magnesium. So between our tissue sampling, our on-farm monitoring, and these lysimeters, we're able to have a whole collection of decision support tools to help us make, our decisions when it comes to irrigation and when it comes to fertility management.